Hey all, welcome to Spoonies United. So in this part of the overview, I'm going to reveal to you one of the things that Tony does to help manage her thoughts and her emotions. But first, I want you to imagine the following scenario. So imagine you're entering a hospital room and you're approaching the bed of a patient. And when you get there, you see a father laying in the bed. He slowly opens his eyes and he says, "I'm very ill. I'm very weak. I'm very, very scared about the future of my health." And maybe this is somebody's father. Maybe he has family members by his bedside. What are some of the thoughts that might be going through your head at this time? What might be some of the feelings you experience? And what might be some of the things that you would say to the father and his family members? So a common response to some of these questions are you might be having feelings of sorrow or sadness or feelings of compassion for the father and his family. As far as what you would say, you might say things like, "I'm really sorry. I'm so sorry this is happening to you." You might do things to try to help the family. You might say, "Hey, what can I do to help?" So what you would be doing is practicing something called compassion. And compassion is when you want to ease or end suffering in somebody. So practicing compassion can almost come naturally sometimes. You see, a very difficult situation where somebody's suffering, we almost have this tendency to want to reach out and help. Practicing self-compassion or compassion for yourself can be challenging, can be unnatural. So people that struggle with illness or health challenges, they frequently become very self-critical. So they get into this thought process of maybe blaming themselves or being scared about their future or being sad about, what they've lost. So these kind of thoughts are going to increase levels of anxiety and depression. But what if you were to change your strategy in regards to how you were going to talk back to yourself? What if you used the same level of compassion that you had for that father and his family towards yourself? How do you think that would make you feel differently? How would that change maybe your perception of life or your perception of your health situation? So that's referred to as practicing something called self-compassion. So we're going to look at a couple examples of different types of thoughts. And so the first thought we're going to look at is somebody who's having a health challenge that is having self-critical thoughts. And this is something that's going to happen to everyone, right? Everyone that has these health challenges at times are going to have self-critical thoughts. So let's look at the example. "This is my fault. My life is terrible. I can no longer live the way I want to." So this kind of thought's probably not going to serve you well. It's going to increase emotions like depression and anxiety. So let's look at a self-compassionate thought that we can use to replace that thought with. So here's an example. "I am so sorry this is happening to you. This has been so hard. You have endured so much. I love you." So again, that might start to change the way you feel inside. Now, according to Tony, one thing she says in her book is we should look for opportunities to practice self-compassion for ourselves. So maybe you're not feeling well and you're having a lot of self-critical thoughts. What you can do is pivot and change your approach. Talk back to yourself in a compassionate way, just like you would talk back to that father. So Tony says it might feel forced at first, but if you keep on doing these self-compassionate practices or talking back to yourself in this way, you will start to change the way you feel about your circumstances. And eventually, she says, you can almost like rewire your brain where it becomes automatic. You don't feel well. Instead of defaulting to self-critical thoughts, you default to thoughts of self-compassion for yourself. So I did some additional research on some of the benefits of self-compassion. So I went to Harvard and Stanford's website. And Harvard had a couple interesting things. They said people who practice self-compassion have lower levels of depression and anxiety. And then Stanford listed some additional benefits of practicing self-compassion. So Stanford's website said people that practice self-compassion have higher levels of self-esteem. People that also practice self-compassion are more resilient. And then also people that practice self-compassion, they're more productive. So this kind of goes back to one of the common things I've been saying in this overview. So if you remember your thoughts, so if you change your thoughts to be self-compassionate, that's going to change your emotions, change how you feel, and then your emotions will lead to different actions. You're going to act differently, do things differently, be more productive. So I have personally played around with self-compassion a little bit. So maybe there's a time where I'm having some chest discomfort, and maybe I'm having some self-critical thoughts like feeling bad for myself, or I'm worried about my future. And what I do is I shift. So I shift over and change my inner dialogue. And you can do this verbally if you want to as well. But I change my inner dialogue to be compassionate for myself. And, I just started doing it. It doesn't necessarily completely fix everything, right? Your anxiety, it's not like your anxiety and depression vanish. But it does help. I feel like it helps take it down a couple notches, the bad emotions. And then the other thing I like about practicing self-compassion that I've noticed is when I'm coming from a place of self-compassion, I feel like I'm almost kind of stepping outside of myself because I'm not used to practicing compassion for myself. I'm used to doing it for other people. So I feel like I'm stepping outside of myself, and I see my health situation a little bit more clearly. I feel more clear-headed about it. I feel like I have better judgment surrounding some of my challenges, where if I'm coming from a place of like fear or depression, I feel like that clouds my judgment quite a bit. So to me, practicing self-compassion can help you see your situation in a much more healthy way. At least that's my experience. So there's different ways you can practice self-compassion. And some of these things Tony mentions in her book, but I did some additional research to see if there's other ways you can practice self-compassion. One we mentioned, so you can change your internal voice, your internal dialogue in your head from self-critical to self-compassionate. You can also verbally talk as well. The other thing that you can do is journal. So some people like to journal, and when you're journaling, obviously you want to do it from a self-compassionate perspective. The other thing that's really good is there are a lot of self-compassion based meditations online. So if you Google that, you'll actually get a lot of meditations, and there's some great ones on YouTube. The other thing I want to mention, so another way to practice self-compassion is, and again, let's actually think back to the father. So I think this is an important point to make. So think back to that father, and let's say he gets discharged from the hospital, and you're talking to him, and he wants some advice from you on what he should do once he gets back home. And you might say things like, just take care of yourself, man. Just rest, spend time with your family, take it easy. Maybe get outside and get some sun. Do those kind of things. And what you're doing is you're being compassionate to the father. You're trying to ease his suffering. Well, you should do the same thing for yourself. You should take care of yourself when you're struggling with some of these challenges. So things you could do is sleep, rest, get outside, get some sun, maybe take a hot bath. And again, this is going to vary a little bit depending on who you are and what your circumstances are, but be good to yourself. Take care of yourself. So the last thing I want to say is I highly encourage everyone to try self-compassion for yourself. to be honest, it's good for you, and you deserve it. You deserve to be compassionate towards yourself. In the next part of this overview, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about a couple other things that Toni does to manage her thoughts and her emotions. Thanks.